Okay, hello. 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 Okay, we're on. So, welcome again. I see some familiar faces from earlier today, but welcome to the National Museum Architecture and to this lecture by Joel Sanders. This talk is part of the public programming series for our exhibition Coming into Community, which is the National Museum's contribution to this year's Oslo Architecture Triennial. My name is Victoria Bugge-Øya. I'm a curator of architecture here at the museum and also the curator of this show. So this year, 2022, Norway celebrates that it is 50 years since the decriminalization of male homosexuality. The Queer Culture Year is an initiative from the National Museum, the National Library, and the Queer Archives at the University of Bergen. And it was initiated as a way to create momentum around this shared responsibility to advance queer art, culture, history, and to support queer artists and audiences. So a particularly important question for us going into the themes of this year's triennial, mission, neighborhood, reforming communities, has been how urban planning looks from queer, feminist, and other marginalized perspectives. That is, for people who have historically fallen outside of the norm. So in our exhibition here at the National Museum Architecture, you can see some historical examples of this. You can also experience the installation by Swedish art and architecture collective MIXdesign based on queer nightclubs, for so many the place where they found their community and their home. So, starting at 6 tonight, there will be a performative artist talk with MIXdesign, followed by a party with DJs and performances from the drag and ballroom scene in Oslo. MIXdesign's walk-through closet, as well as our drag queens and drag king, will be available for styling and makeup advice all night. So it should be a lot of fun. And we're also hosting a poster workshop all day today and tomorrow inside of MIXdesign's installation. This is open for everyone, so please take the time to stop by. And then during this fall, we have a film screening series based on some of the themes from the exhibition, such as Call Me Kuchu, which features the bar Sappho Islands in Kampala, which is also part of the exhibition downstairs. And then finally, we also have our children's programming, Alex in Mykjetland by Remi Johansen Hovda, a site-specific drag storytelling tour in MIXdesign's installation, which is all about transformation and adventure. And I just advise you all to go to our webpage to see more about tours in the exhibition, and also we have a few tours with the curator set up for the fall and also tomorrow. So back to today's talk. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Joel Sanders. We were lucky enough to have him talk to the staff at the National Museum yesterday, and that was great. In the 1990s, Joel was really early beginning to work with questions of sexuality and space. And he was really one of the very first to examine masculinity specifically. In 1996, he edited the book Stud, which examined the role of architecture in the construction of male identity. And Stud was also recently republished as part of Routledge Classics. So from this early work, starting from queer and feminist theories, Joel has consistently continued to challenge norms in architecture. His design and consultancy firm, MIXdesign, works actively to create architecture that is more accessible and welcoming to all. And in the past few years, he's been one of incredibly few designers who have truly begun to rethink bathroom design from the bottom up, you might say, with his project Stalled. And in addition to his own design work, he's also a professor at Yale School of Architecture. And we're also very lucky to have Exutoire with us here today, who is an Oslo-based collective consisting of Paul-Antoine Lucas and Boy Ki-son, who will lead a conversation with Joel after his talk. Like Joel, Exutoire are true multi-talents who do design work, graphic design, curating, and art, always from a transversal queer perspective. And I know that this week they've been very, very busy with the OIT Academy and the Triennial. And also since January 2022, Exetor has been guest curators in residence at Rom for kunst og arkitektur, or art and architecture, here in Oslo, and in charge of a program of exhibitions and events on queerness and architecture. So Joel is going to be talking for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have half an hour conversation with Exetor. And there will be some room for questions from the audiences as well towards the end. So we'll be done about 4:15. Great. So with no further ado, please welcome Joel.
Well, thank you, Victoria, and also to Caroline for inviting me. When I got this invitation, I leapt at the opportunity, not only because it was great to be part of this program, but I've been sort of become a Scandinavia fan for the past 5 years, and so I've been to the other Scandinavian countries, not Norway, tried to get in. It was COVID, they wouldn't let me in but a few months ago, so here I am, my pass to Oslo. So thank you. So again, JSA MIXdesign, that's my New York-based studio, is composed of 2 overlapping branches. JSA is an architectural studio, and we specialize in doing work for higher education, projects like these, like Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, NYU, as well as art museums. And art museum projects include, we worked on the Yale University Art Gallery, pictured here, the ICA at the UPenn, and we reinstalled the permanent collection of the National Museum of Stockholm that opened in 2018, and it was these visits for that project that made me a kind of Nordic fan. And so today I'm going to focus on, again, a kind of trip down memory lane. In my teaching and practice over the course of my career, I've been thinking about the intersection of gender, human identity, and space through a queer lens. And this talk, From Stud to Stalled, traces the development of my thinking about these issues over the past, and here I'm dating myself, about 25, 26 years, from the publication of Stud, Architectures of Masculinity, it came out in 1996, to the launching of Stalled, a design research project of MIXdesign, again, that inclusive design consultancy I began in 2018. And 2 intentions shaped this talk. First, I think of it as a historical account that might be of interest to a younger generation of architects and architectural historians who have begun to map the emergence of what back in the 1990s, when I was your age, many of you in the audience, was a new field of inquiry, queer space. And second, I think of my own career as a kind of barometer that registers how the relationship between gender studies, embodied identity, and architecture have evolved over the past 25 years. And this is based on the premise that I'm not so interesting in my own right, but that maybe my intellectual development mirrors larger trends in the architectural community at large. And also I want to say that I see this retrospective talk as an opportunity for critical self-reflection. Along the way, I'm going to stop and evaluate some of the earlier work I'll talk about from a contemporary perspective, indicating which ideas I think are still relevant today and which I've rejected entirely or revised. And so the common theme that runs through this journey is an everyday architectural type that has fascinated me for over 25 years, and they're bathrooms. And organized around water, bathrooms span multiple scales. They cater to the intimate needs of the biological flesh while relying on large-scale infrastructures to work. And they're in every building type that we design, and they're one of the most expensive rooms that we designed. But what fascinates me most about restrooms is that, contrary to the prevailing assumption that their design is shaped and determined by objective requirements, they are in fact sites, spaces, places that I think register our culture's most deep-seated ingrained cultural assumptions and fears about the body. So, again, the stud came about due to the convergence of personal, professional, and political forces in my life. In 1996, I was a young assistant professor at Princeton School of Architecture. I had very recently come out as a gay man. That didn't make my colleagues happy, believe it or not, at that time. Things were different. And one of my best friends, John Potsy, to whom Stud is dedicated, had been diagnosed with AIDS, which was before the development of antiviral drugs and was considered a death sentence. And I, like many gay men of this time, was consumed by a sense of grief and rage directed against what was the Ronald Reagan administration that had turned a complete blind eye to the epidemic. And so I wanted to make a contribution to queer activism through the medium that I knew best, which was architecture. I was kind of disaffected from what was then the prevailing movement, deconstructivist architecture. You might have heard of it. It was showcased at MoMA. My colleagues were the curators. And I just felt, well, you know, it was inventive, but it left me cold because I thought it was indifferent to contemporary events. And so I found the inspiration that I was looking for by looking outside the discipline of architecture. And I would say that that has been an ongoing trope. I tend to get my best ideas, my best inspiration by looking outside the discipline to others. In this case, it was through two movements affiliated with identity politics: queer activism and queer theory. I became friends with three members of a group called Grand Fury. They were an artist collective who created very provocative agitprop visual materials that were designed to disseminate the message of the group that they worked with, ACT UP. It was a grassroots movement. It became international, and it was protesting particularly the American government's indifference to the AIDS crisis. So Stud invited artists, architects, and theorists to look at the role that architecture played in the construction of male identities, but through a queer lens. And it was based on the notion of gender as performance. And this is an idea I still subscribe to today. And the idea of performance was borrowed from queer theorist Judith Butler. And she argued that human identity in general and gender identity in particular are not inborn, innate biological traits, but rather culturally learned modes of behavior. And Butler, as well as who was then Judith Halberstam and is now a wonderful theorist, Jack Halberstam, referred to drag queens and drag kings as examples, right? They exaggerated how, through gesture, makeup, and costumes, gender is not innate but performed. And so I came to realize that the performance of gender depends at least in part on space, on design. Queer theory encouraged me to shift my attention away from my colleagues' preoccupation with the building as a kind of stunning sculptural object that was fashionable at that time, and instead to think about space and to conceive of space as a medium in which human interaction takes place. So influenced by Butler, I came to embrace a conception of the built environment as a stage that enables people, like actors, to perform their various roles. And Cindy Sherman's iconic film stills, two represented here, is an artist, I think, who demonstrates this idea. She demonstrates or impersonates different versions of womanhood as represented in Hollywood film, and underscores in the process the kind of interrelationship between fashion, interior design, and architecture. So, for example, in these two images, Sherman is impersonating two sort of classic Hollywood female types, the kind of sex kitten and the ingenue. Okay? And again, it's obvious, I think, that she integrates body language, cosmetic, hair, makeup, but costume, fashion, form-fitting lace dress, or sexy lingerie, as well as the interior, furniture, a mirror, floral sheets that almost are like a kind of Baroque drapery that echoes her clothing. Okay? And all to situate so that we can identify these two protagonists in a place, the bedroom, that allows us to, the bedroom, which is a place, of course, associated with femininity, sex, vulnerability, desire, and even violence, right? And you can see she's looking out the window. She's at the door, something is about to happen. Okay, so Stud is divided into 5 sections, and each section was devoted to exploring an everyday building type: the home, the office, the bathroom, the gym, and the park. And this approach is based on a premise that I still subscribe to today, that the performance of human identity takes places within what we call architecture building types. Okay? Formulaic spaces associated with specific activities that distribute bodies within spatial configurations, which in turn shape the way humans interact with one another and shape their identities. And building types tend, and that's the theme of my talk, they tend to perpetuate problematic cultural assumptions about embodied identity. But architects and users can decide to contest these norms through appropriation and revision. And so Stud devoted a chapter to the space I've been preoccupied with, that's the bathroom, or in this case, the public men's room, revealing it to be, to quote an author, Lee Edelman, a theater of heterosexual anxiety. And Lee Edelman described in his essay how the configuration of the interior walls and partitions of a conventional men's room distributes eyes and bodies in ways that actually initiate the very activities that these privacy partitions were supposed to protect us against, okay? That is, the partitions between urinals, although designed to prohibit men looking at one's neighbor peeing, often trigger anxious feelings about male inadequacy and forbidden same-sex desire. And so Lee describes, and I became very interested, how gay men have historically mined the homoerotic potential of an everyday space like the restroom by appropriating these typical design elements and using them in subversive ways. For example, gay male cruising in public restrooms depended on the gaps, cracks, and holes found in urinal and toilet stall partitions. And so shortly after completing Stud, my newly launched architectural studio received a series of residential commissions from gay clients, like this one, House for a Bachelor. And they afforded me the opportunity to, for me and my staff, to transpose tactics, motifs, derived from Stud's analysis of men's rooms to residential designs. So for example, this project, the Foredrag Loft, 1999, was a loft renovation in Manhattan for a gay male client. And we were interested in dissolving the boundary between two, typically, at least in the States, adjacent wet spaces, a bathroom and a kitchen, that are traditionally divided from one another due to prevailing standards of privacy. And so our scheme celebrates rather than conceals the spatial proximity of these two zones that are often back-to-back. Why? Because they share a common plumbing riser that runs through a vertical building. Okay? And so we consolidated or exposed this proximity by putting both in a concrete plumbing island, the diagram shown above. And as you can see, a translucent glass panel bisects this island, screening the kitchen from the bathroom, now treated as a kind of stage, as a step platform that resembles a stage and that opens directly onto the master bedroom. And so, again, inspired by Lee Edelman's Stud, the Foredrag Loft attempted to destabilize the kind of active, passive, subject, object, male, female binary that informs conventional domestic spectatorship, right? The idea that men look and women are looked at. Now men could also be the subject and object of the gaze. And again, how by dissolving the boundary between bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen and treating them all as spaces dedicated to embodied pleasure. So you look at this now and you go, big deal, but when it was published, believe it or not, okay, in Interior Design magazine, for example, in 2000, we received really hate mail from a lot of people who said, "Oh, these designs would only appeal to a niche market of alternative lifestyles," meaning profane gay men like myself. But however, beginning around 2000, we began to receive commissions that gave us the chance to reinterpret what were then gay-specific design strategies, many of them inspired by Studd's contributors to the design of domestic spaces for clients beyond the gay community. So, for example, this is 25 Columbus Circle. It's designed for two heterosexual parents with grown children. They happen to be Dutch. It incorporates these what became signature queer elements, and they were kind of tropes that we were playing with, inspired by Hugh Hefner and Playboy and bachelor pads, these gadgets like sliding bedroom walls or buttons you could press that would allow people to seduce women, by turning a couch into a mattress. And so we kind of had things like that. And also this idea of a switch light bathroom glass that became the headboard that joined the bathroom with the bedroom. So in less than a decade, and this is hard to believe for you in the audience, this is very, obvious and every day. But these were subversive tactics, and now they have become mainstream. And as you know, they're not only a common feature in my work and other people's residential work, but in high-end residential developer hotels and apartments around the world. And so one takeaway that I still believe then and now is that looking at architecture through an outsider perspective, through a queer lens, in this case, through the eyes of myself, a gay man during the AIDS crisis, can lead to innovative design ideas that could be more broadly accepted by a wider public. We're innovators. And I could say this thing from a kind of arrogant, queer-centric perspective, which is that I think my work is just another example of how queer, what were once queer subcultural aesthetics, migrate and become mainstream. So, now let's fast forward to 2015. In 2015, national debates in the US sparked by the moral panic, and it was debates I was reading about every day about the question of transgender people accessing public restrooms. And it led me again to return to the bathroom as a locus of cultural anxiety. However, this time, not through a kind of gay male, but through a transgender perspective. And so, just a background, in 2016, President Obama, a liberal member of the Democratic Party, passed a federal law mandating that public schools allow students to use the men's or women's room or locker room that aligned with their gender identity. And in response, there was a huge conservative backlash. It began with North Carolina, followed by more than 12 Republican states. They were called bathroom bills, and they mandated that sex-segregated restrooms could only be used by people according to the sex assigned to them at birth or on their birth certificate. And so I reached out to Susan Stryker, who is a leading transgender historian, theorist, and activist, about the design implications of this social justice issue. And it began just with an academic essay published here in the South Atlantic Quarterly or Queer Work, projects like Stud, for example, that suffered from a very reductive binary conception of gender that narrowly focused on the experience of white, middle-class, able-bodied, cisgender gay men like myself. And I think this was a kind of prevailing attitude. At that time, men and lesbians dominated queer movements, and it was a mentality of that time that still believed primarily that there were two sexes, men and women. Gay and lesbians, were considered to be biological men and women who just deviated from a norm, and what distinguished them and what defined their identities was their same-sex desire. Let's see if this works. However, trans, non-binary, intersex, and other gender non-conforming people demonstrate that there are many ways of expressing one's gender identity that are independent of biological sex, independent of sexual orientation, and that fall outside of the norms that are spatialized and naturalized in the binary sex-segregated restroom. But Susan also insisted that we needed to leverage a new trend that was occurring around that time, trans visibility. Mainstream American magazines like Vanity Fair, these are American magazines, and Time featured former sports person Bruce Jenner, now identified as Caitlyn Jenner, and also RuPaul. They put them on their cover. And there was a hit series of the time, Transparent, that depicted middle-class California, whose father comes out as a trans person. And Susan argued that we needed to leverage this visibility, but to look beyond the gay, lesbian, and trans community and think about a spectrum of non-normative bodies that the discipline of architecture has overlooked. And Susan's recommendation that we cast a wider net proved to be a turning point, and not only for Stahl, this project, but also for the work that MIXdesign, my consultancy, or our consultancy, is pursuing today. It led us to adopt the underlying principle that informs our design approach, intersectionality. As design activists, we realized we needed to expand our scope and consider the intersecting needs of those who've been historically excluded, not only from restrooms, but from public spaces in America and around the world. And these are people of different ages, races, genders, religions, and disabilities who, again, the discipline of architecture has overlooked. And so, just to put this into perspective, the way we've overlooked these populations. Since antiquity, Western architects and designers, from Vitruvius, Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, to Henry Dreyfuss, a mid-century product designer, have designed buildings based on studying and measuring the characteristics of two kinds of people, an ideal classical body or a normal body. But both of them were assumed to be white, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual, and male. And this data, this supposedly objective data, was and has and continues to be the basis of design standards and building codes encoded in textbooks, architectural guidelines, and regulatory codes and laws that are still in use today. During the 20th century, Europeans and Americans used this supposedly objective information to validate eugenics, or scientific racism, a pseudoscience that categorized humans into two hierarchical classes: superior, able-bodied white people, as opposed to inferior people marked by race, gender, or ethnicity. And at different moments in American history, and I would say also European history, including, unfortunately, our own, it has been used to justify discriminatory policies determining who has access to and who is excluded from public space. And this has included women, people of color, immigrants, and the disabled. And based on a recurring assumption, the same version of a recurring argument, that these populations possess either innate physical, mental, or moral defects that render them unfit to enter the public realm. And so, for example, in America, Jim Crow laws segregated whites from blacks in bathrooms, drinking fountains, restrooms, train cars in the South from 1865 until the 1960s. I was alive. I didn't even know at the time that this was happening in my own lifetime. And Trump's border wall, many of you heard about, was again meant to protect, good white American citizens from the threat of Mexican immigrants. Again, only two examples of spatial complicity. So MIXdesign, our consultancy, is dedicated to combating our discipline's complicity in reinforcing racism, heteronormativity, and ableism. And we work with clients to apply inclusive design tools that take the form of recommendations and prototypes for everyday building types. And we're working on museums and university campuses, as well as restrooms, which I'm going to focus on. And our work is based on a series of design principles which build upon but differentiate themselves from the important foundation laid by, in America, what's called the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, that was passed in 1990. This act of federal law tends to focus on people with physical disabilities, primarily people in wheelchairs, and to a limited extent, sensory disabilities. But what we've been trying to do is, again, cast a wider net and study the intersecting factors that constitute human identity and experience, and we think about disability, people with mobility, sensory, and neurodiverse challenges. We think about gender, women, trans, non-binary folk. And also we think about culture, the spatial requirements associated with race and religion. And we are opposed, and we hope offer an alternative to what in America is the separate but equal model that's characteristic of most accessibility standards and guidelines. And these tend to prescribe separate physical accommodations like ramps and entrances, which maybe unintentionally, but they still segregate and they stigmatize those people who are different, those people, we use the term, with special needs. And so we've developed a three-step inclusive design methodology, represented in this diagram, designed to foster sharing among individuals, families, friends, and cohorts, and caregivers. First, what we do, we take a deep dive. We analyze the needs of the diverse list of end users that we're thinking about. So this is a diagram of a restroom. So we begin to think about different populations, age, gender, race, disability. Okay? We think about the activities these people perform, in this case, grooming, washing, caregiving, eliminating. And then we do a kind of cross-comparative analysis, and our goal is to look for places of overlap, places of sharing, where these different user communities could come together in the same public space. And the outcome is a form of recommendations, a playbook, if you will, of design strategies from materials and finishes, ideas about signage, about wayfinding, about furniture, about fixtures, and even about, well, not even about, but most importantly, we find about atmosphere, the look and feel of a space. And particularly, we find acoustics and lighting becomes very, very important. And our goal is to enable the maximum number of what we say differently embodied and identified people to interact or mix in public space, and so hence our name, MIXdesign. But we also realize that some populations do have unique functional and privacy needs that require privacy. So we try to provide choice, opportunities to share, but opportunities to be alone. So let me illustrate how we're attempting to put MIXdesign principles into practice by discussing MIXdesign's first initiative, Stalled, and it started in 2015 in response to American debates about transgender access to public restrooms that pitted, as I said, liberals against Democrats. And we brought together this interdisciplinary team, and what we realized that we needed to distinguish ourselves from all of this stuff that we were reading from lawyers and journalists and even architects. Why? Because everybody took for granted that there was two rooms, a men's and a women's room. Okay? We consider ourselves binary abolitionists, and we thought, let's look at this from a design perspective and from a social justice perspective. And another thing that we also were calling into question is this idea that the sex-segregated restroom, this is the argument that went to the Supreme Court for those who were opposed to trans restroom, that idea of the universal privacy between the sexes, this idea that there are two sexes, men and women, and that these populations have and continue to need universal privacy. So we have a kind of two-step process. Before drawing and coming up with design, we do analysis through a historical lens, and our team is composed of legal experts, political experts, as well as experts in the different user groups that we serve. The very first thing we did is we looked at this through the lens of American political history. We learn that bathroom controversies are not new. At different moments in American history, the public restroom has been a crucible that registers social anxieties about the threat of a series of marginalized groups entering into mainstream society. Historical milestones illustrated here include the introduction of a separate, what was called a ladies' room to accommodate the first women entering the workplace in 1880s. Later, the fight to abolish colored bathrooms during the civil rights movement. And the fight also that I witnessed during the 80s to this fear of contamination posed by gay men who it was believed by sharing public lavatories with straight men would infect them with AIDS. And also the fight of the disability rights movement. And we also delved into design history to trace the evolution of restrooms from antiquity to today. And we found that it refutes, again, this argument about the universal privacy between the sexes. Why? Because we found from antiquity till the late 18th century, men, women, and children bathed and even toileted together in communal places like houses, latrines, privies. Illustrated here, a whole family would sort of do their thing, right, together. It was also a communal social activity, and their accounts, for example, London Bridge during the Middle Ages had holes in the roadbed, and people would just pull down their pants and talk and converse as they shat into the river. And of course, that had dire health implications. But the point is that this idea that we accept today of the sex-segregated restroom was made possible by the advent of plumbing and also the rise of kind of prurient Victorian values about the shame of the body. And that was the first time that washing, grooming, and eliminating came together. So, looking at bathrooms through the political, through the lens of architectural history, allowed us to think out of the norm of sex-segregated restrooms and offer alternatives to the generally accepted solution for all gender restrooms in the US, and that was a single restroom. Here, it's a supplement to the sex-segregated restroom. It's a step in the right direction, but studies have shown that it tends to isolate and it stigmatizes those people who are different, not only trans and non-binary folk, but people in wheelchairs, people with disabilities. And so instead, we favor this type, the multi-user facility, and we began to work in 2017 with Gallaudet University, School for the Deaf in Washington, D.C., to begin to retrofit back-to-back sex-segregated restrooms into a multi-user solution. Again, and the idea here is that it eliminates the binary, treats it as one open porous space that opens onto the corridor, no doors. It has a series of differently sized fixture of different heights. We have communal washing facilities on either side. And again, this idea that we've acquired extra space on the hallway and we've introduced a lounge, again, to think of the bathroom as a catalyst, as a kind of social condenser. Okay. Let me just move forward if I can. Why is this not? Sorry, we're having a little problem. Okay, so we've implemented multiple versions of this multi-user prototype at Gallaudet, a school for the deaf, again in Washington, at their student center in locker rooms. And we also learned that innovative design solutions are not enough, that making this multi-user type, at least in America, meant amending the plumbing code. American codes say there must be a men's and women's room. We joined forces with a lawyer on our team. We joined forces with the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, and the National Center for Transgender Equality. We lobbied and we were successful, and in the 2021 version of the code now makes possible the type that we're advocating. And also over the past 5 years, we've continued to develop stalled prototypes in partnership with students and faculty at Yale Public Health, as well as a new member of our team, Erin Friedlander. She's a clinician and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And what we have found from this collaboration, that what began as a kind of social justice endeavor, we learned has public health implications. There's an enormous amount of data that shows that spaces, including restrooms, right, have a profound impact on the physical and mental health of human beings. And second, our collaborations with public health, as well as Joss Boyce, who's in the audience today, sort of opened my eyes to an alternative to the top-down approach exemplified by the heroic modern architect or today's starchitect. This person who was more often than not a celebrated white male genius, whose vision is only compromised by the input of clients, let alone users. Okay? And instead, Joss, and she's sitting in the audience, and we had like a weekend. She came to visit me in my cabin, and we were in this little cabin fighting over this issue, and I said, you know, you can't ask end users to come up with sophisticated ideas on their own. She said, Joel, you're wrong, and she was right. And so what we're doing now is we're using a variety of tools, I wish there was more time to talk about it, to basically obtain meaningful feedback from the lived experience of the users who are going to use a space that will then inform the design process. And so, and there are kind of three tools that we've been focusing on. Literature reviews, like take a deep dive, what's the research? Surveys, we also conduct interviews, but the major breakthrough, and that was again Joss that I credit, are workshops that have become central to our practice. And through these tools, we then were able to identify an expanded list of end users whose needs were not being met in restrooms. And they included breastfeeding women, cisgender women and trans men who menstruate, people who perform medical procedures, people with shy bladder syndrome, and Muslims who perform ablutions before prayer. And so we incorporated these expanded end-user considerations based on data that we've received from this participatory design with my colleagues at Public Health and a whole series of projects we're working on right now at different universities in America. But I just want to show you this. It's a speculative project. We were asked to design an installation that's currently on view at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in New York. This is it, called Design and Peace. And the curator said, Joel and company, can you apply stalled principles to reimagine the Cooper Hewitt's ground floor restrooms, the existing condition, as you can see there, which happen to be located adjacent to public spaces like a lecture room and a design studio and a classroom. And we said, okay. And we did a mini version of participatory design. We met with the guards and security officers and curators and administrators and came up with this prototype. And it basically reconceives of this ground floor as a wellness hub. I'll take you very quickly through it. Visitors would enter, and they would be greeted by this digital display screen. It plays soothing audio music, masking bathroom noises, because there's a lot of studies that show that particularly younger people avoid public restrooms because of the sound of urinating or shitting, okay? Also, it's a place where visitors of all ages can refill water bottles or drink from a multi-height water fountain. And immediately, the guard, who is normally out of sight, and in America is often a person of color, is also a kind of greeter, receptionist who provides information. There's a multi-height in the bathroom itself on the upper part of the screen. Again, a multi-height counter at different heights, so users, children, wheelchair users can come together. Touch-free faucets and hand dryers are hygienic and easier to use for some people with disabilities. And there are these translucent windows that allow views into the adjacent lounge, which I'll talk about. Again, it's equipped with stalls of different sizes, standard, ADA, but also, again, what I mentioned before, we learned that some people, like Muslim women, Orthodox Jews in America, require complete privacy. So we have caregiving stalls equipped with sink, toilet, mirror, so that anyone, and including myself, because I'm a little modest guy, I don't like to kind of do stuff in public, I can go there as well. Okay. Also, we learned lactation rooms, if they appear, they're often somewhere else. Why not consolidate them in this wellness hub? Comfortable chairs, sink, and changing table for all people, men, women, trans people, who are either breastfeeding or using a breast pump. We also, through our research, advocate including a prayer room in a wellness hub that offers meditative interfaith. It's a meditative interfaith space that includes shoe racks and a foot shower for Muslims who clean, right, who need to be in a kind of cleaning zone before they conduct their prayer. And treated it as an extension. I'm going to skip this slide anyway. And finally, this lounge is, again, treated as a porous extension of this wellness hub. It's a place where visitors can take a break, recharge their minds and bodies, as well as their personal electronic devices, right there, plugs. And it's designed to promote conversation and has flexible multi-height seating. And we learn from Q Arroyo, our disability specialist, who himself is in a wheelchair, that people in wheelchairs don't want to just look at other people who can sit next to each other. They want to sit next to other people. And so there are periodic slots that allow them to sit side by side. Also, we learned from our deaf space specialist, Hansel Baumann, that high back seating that's colored is a good backdrop for American Sign Language. And we included a calm zone, an escape space, and it's a semi-enclosed room with soft tactile acoustics, wall panels. Light is very important, non-reverberant, glare-free interiors. And again, we learned that it's a quiet refuge for everyone, but especially those on the autism spectrum who are prone to sensory overload in public spaces. And so I'm just going to end by just saying that the advent of the pandemic we have unexpectedly received all kinds of much larger commissions, okay? And principally now we're working for institutional clients like art museums and universities. And they're interested in demonstrating their commitment to what we call in America DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, again in response to Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, which in America has raised awareness that who is disproportionately affected in these kinds of crises? People of color and BIPOC communities and the disabled. And so, and so I don't have time to talk about them, but we have a whole series of commissions at museums, including the Queen's Museum, as well as college campuses. We're building a new ground-up residential college for 500 students at Princeton University. And I think what's really also brought in sort of a new challenge to our work is to deal with something that's even more subtle and nuanced, is making spaces make spaces that allow people of different races, and particularly people of color in America, feel that they belong in elite universities like where I teach, Yale or Princeton University. Okay, and so just to wrap up, to conclude, hindsight is 20/20. So looking back at my earlier queer work that began with Stud in 1996, I now hope I shared with you both what I think are its strengths and limitations. Stud is a time capsule. It was shaped by and ultimately constrained by what, from today's perspective, I now realize was my very reductive and now outmoded binary conception of gender that was prevalent at that time. And it tended to focus again on the experience not only of gay men, but also of able-bodied, cisgendered, Christian people. And one. A second, but what I'm still proud of about that work is that today we've sort of expanded that interest in gender alone, cast a wider net, and as I've shown you, Mix is focused on a much more inclusive conception of human identity and embodiment that sees these diverse intersecting criteria. Also, then and now, the work is invested in exposing and dismantling how the seemingly innocent conventions of architecture, again supposedly based on objective functional criteria, are actually social constructs. However, today, our research methodology has expanded beyond Stud was focused on building types. But today, again, we are looking much more broadly, and in particular looking at the way standards that are disseminated in professional textbooks, publications, magazines, and laws and building codes, again, have the ability, have and continue to perpetuate problematic assumptions that perpetuate heteronormativity and whiteness and ableism. But moving forward means looking back. And proposing alternative futures requires us to situate contemporary issues through a historical lens. We believe that only by looking back can we move forward to dismantle architecture's long-standing complicity in perpetuating these problematic assumptions about human distance. History, when looked at through an outsider perspective, and I think that's what we might in our conversation talk about, looking at the world through a queer lens becomes a catalyst for creativity, something that will allow us to use the metaphor of the car, to confidently drive forward and imagine unforeseen, promising destinations that will enhance the lives, hopefully, of all bodies, no matter their ability, gender, identity. So thank you, and I hope I didn't go on too long. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joel. So my name is Sun, and this is Paul Antoine, and we're very happy to be here today to witness your lecture and also like to have this chat with you. And your publication has been has played a very important role in our research on queer theory, and especially the evolution of the of queer theory today. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you.
And I would like to also thank Charlotte, Karianne, and Victoria for inviting us, and for the National Museum to host the discussion. So maybe, as you said, what we wanted to focus also this discussion about was this idea of two generations also. As you said, you also observed that resurgence of those questions in architecture, which we also did feel like that. And when reading your revisitation of your preface for Stud, we could also see that the situation you were in at the time is to some extent quite similar to the way that we felt in a very different context. Mm. There was the AIDS pandemic, which of course is now a different question, but we also saw that our practice being settled within the Black Lives Matter movement also brought up new questions to some extent, and we could see that this interest in queer theory as also an alternative way of looking at a way of looking at alternative futures was very linked to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now a new generation is looking at the field of inquiry from a historical perspective as well. The way you see it, it's a lot of people go back and look at the references because somehow there's been a gap also of knowledge at some point. And we think that this idea of looking at the history of queer spaces around the world is somehow an attempt to write a history tainted by erasure, to kind of build up that memory that is not always there. While we do see the importance of such studies, we can also see their pitfalls today. And it presents the risk of falling into a certain nostalgia and romanticization of the past instead of addressing new critical problems today. So you said that in your conclusion, and your practice nowadays is very much based on willing to embrace also the evolutive character of queer theory into re-questioning and re-challenging itself, which you did also in 2021. And now your practice includes gender studies, critical race studies, and disability studies as fields in your work. How do you reconcile this need to constantly evolve as a practitioner with this idea also of being involved in like fixed building work, like studying types, and also bringing guidelines together? How do you see the evolution of those guidelines in the future?
Well, I mean, a couple of things that you raised. You know, one, and I'm also looking at my colleague Joss in the audience. I'm going to implicate her because we were both talking. You know, Joss was talking earlier about her role in the 70s and 80s in Matrix and the republication of Stud, and some people, maybe could think of both of us as historical artifacts, that deserve to be like put in a dusty museum, and it's both a compliment and a curse, I think, that we both can feel. But I think it's double-edged. Like on the one hand, I found it very promising that particularly we would get calls from young scholars. Actually, most of them were from Europe more than in America, who were writing and trying to kind of trace the evolution of queer architecture, okay? And so I do think it's important, like your project, the Matrix project, that it's important to archive and represent, okay, these populations who were so marginalized they were rendered invisible. So we do need to kind of record these histories. And I think it really, is a great sign that the younger generation like you and young scholars like you and architects are interested in this work. Also, I know there's been a lot of exhibitions around the world. Again, Joss was talking about the Barbican, but there was a wonderful exhibition I saw that again looked at the erasure of queer havens, like nightclubs and bars. Like in London, we know that this is also happening, in New York. A lot of it has to do with gentrification, right? I think the second thing, though, obviously, is the internet. And I think that gets back to this issue of nostalgia that you were talking about. That I, as an old man, back in the day, I met other people, other men, and it wasn't just for sex, but obviously for, I wasn't that good, that attractive. But anyway, but it was about hanging out and meeting a community and forming community, and it happened in physical space, right? Be it a bar or a cafe, but even on the street. That's not happening, it feels so much anymore because of the internet. So I'm going to turn the question to you. Do you feel that social media, which has changed the venues and ways in which queer people meet each other, has made your generation nostalgic for the gay bars, the sex clubs that we went to?
Well, I'm sure that the infrastructure, like today's infrastructure for social spaces has changed a lot. Like it's completely different. But I think like the same issues, or like what these spaces are celebrating, but what is problematic about them is still there in a way, because whether you are like in a physical space or in a digital space, like discrimination still exists. So I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, but because of racism, because of transphobia, because of so many forms of discrimination, like even digital platforms are still something that I'm extremely skeptical and also scared of. So I think even I think that the interest has like the same interest is still there in sort of like digging back into queer theory and how that can be manifested through spatial configurations. But there's also like this shift of I don't know, of the field, in the sense that like it has to be like I do feel like everybody is aware that it needs to be expanded and it needs to be deepened as well in so many ways. But at the same time, I guess there is a sense of nostalgia.
I would say, in my opinion, that you're exactly touching right upon that. I think because it became so digital, then those spaces, in a way, are disappearing. And I think MIXdesign talks about it also in their work. But I really like, for example, the title Coming Into Community of the exhibition now, taking the nightclub, but also making it some sort of public space. So it's like this transposition that I think we also need to think about, because the vocabulary of spaces that queer spaces to look at is so limited then to the bathroom, the nightclub, and all of this. So how does that become either maybe a basis, but also how can we think that instead of revisiting those archetypes or ideas, how do we rethink collectivity? Like how do we rethink public space to be more inclusive of different bodies?
And I think, the installation downstairs by MIXdesign, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, I think speaks to this other theme I think that we had also talked about previously in our conversations, is that let's say queer spaces, or even let's say queer architectural tropes and features and ways of reappropriating and subverting public space that used to be subcultural, right now becomes like a toolkit that people in the future, everyone, not only queer people, can use. And I think that's what that installation is about downstairs, right? It becomes a liberatory space for everyone at the museum, right? And I think that that's what, I know at least I'm trying to do, and my impression is you're trying to do that as well.
Yeah. Because I think now like what lies in queer theory, or like bringing forth queer theory, is this idea of queering, so as an active manifestation, and as a certain like transgression of all kinds of norms, maybe beyond the limits of gender. But then I think we had another question, I think very linked to this, which is so today, like now, like with MIXdesign, you're actually investigating more concrete projects, but like using sort of like the queer lens. And then we understand that when you adopt the queer lens into a design process, that also means that you must challenge the design process itself. So questions like, who gets to be included in this design process, and how that can be represented and manifested and communicated as well. Those questions arise. So would you tell us a bit more about your design methodology and how this critical, collective, and interdisciplinary thinking is actually working out for you?
Right. Well, a couple of things come to mind, and again, I think this also came up in a different way in Joss's talk, that I think what we're interested in is using, let's say, a queer lens, not to necessarily make space like that are nicer gay bars or, better watering holes for gay people in particular, although that's not bad, right? But using this as an outsider perspective to think out of the box, to think out of these norms and conventions and imagine alternative futures for everyone. And for example, about the work we're doing now, we are, and it really is a function, I think, at least in America, of the world changing. And we used to call universities up and say, do you want to meet with us? You really should be interested in what we have to say. And now, we are really inundated with panicked institutional clients, but they're panicked, okay? And I would say it's double-edged, okay? They feel like they're, okay? To make an anti-racist campus or an all-gender campus, okay? So we're suddenly getting these huge projects I've never thought of we'd ever get, and be careful what you wish for. But that gets, I think, back to strategy. So most of the people call me up because they still think of me as the stud guy, and the thing that people identify when they think of inclusive space is the problem of inclusive restrooms, because the students are protesting. Okay, so we often come to the table and say, you think, I don't say this to them, but it's like, you think we're here, right? Me, the gay guy, and you're going to have me help you fix your problem. And instead we say, no, what we need to do is use this as again, to cast a wider net and think about your much broader problem, which is this, and this, thinking intersectionally. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But then getting back to tools, and this comes back again to Joss's influence in participatory design. So what we find that a lot of these big, again, elite institutions that we're working with, they have a lot of resources, okay? They're so scared, okay? And when we say to them, so what they've drank the Kool-Aid, as we say in English, and so in the room, we'll have all these white people, okay, who represent staff and administrator and teachers, so they think they're being really inclusive. It's not just talking to the provost, okay? But then we say, well, don't you think we really need to bring in students, and not only able-bodied students, but people representing disability and this, that, and the other? And depending on the institution, they often say no. They're too afraid of what's going to happen, okay? And I could go on and on with this. We have months of meeting with one major university to the highest level of administration had to approve the curated list of people and students that we were going to invite to a workshop. Okay? And so sometimes that feels like, it's like, what the fuck am I doing? You know, how could I be doing this? Okay, and then other times I think maybe it's a worthwhile thing. Maybe there are different ways of changing the system, grassroots protests, you know, or trying to change the system from within. But maybe if you really are steady and slow, you can sort of affect change. And I'd like to think, and it could be self-serving, that when you affect change in a lot of these privileged institutions, that they, at least in America, are still leaders and other people follow. Yeah. But I don't know. And sometimes I get, anyway, I'm talking too much behind the scenes, but it's complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like,
Yeah.
not to throw any shade, but like we talked to Make It the other day, and we were like, oh, it's such a shame that the party has to end at 10. And then they told us that, yeah, I mean, there are so many level of institutional barriers, and you can only spend your effort and your time on breaking one or the other, and like it has to take time.
Yeah. But are you finding that in the work that you're doing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think we have a long career to maybe address all of the questions that we cannot find answers for now.
But I think nowadays also, like, maybe there's this idea of larger institution being questioning that problem, and that also involves its sets of problems, and that's kind of what you're now asked to kind of deal with when you have museums and university contacting you. We don't have that, and I think there's also a different generation where now there are other movements that come into play, where you have smaller institutions. We have Gertrud from Rome for Kunst und Architecture, who has kind of hired you as guest curator in residence, or I mean, we have a residency there as guest curator investigating that problem, and then the freedom of the institution is very different. So I think there's a way to move forward. That's very interesting to see also that now it comes back in different ways. But I mean, as Justice also reprint this year with a new preface was saying, it still comes back in circles. So you still have to rebuild what was said before when there was a gap. But then I think it does slowly evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. But also I think and again, I hope I don't sound like a patronizing old man, but for younger people like you, who are maybe just beginning their careers or in the middle of careers, I think what's more hopeful than when my time was that, first of all, social media, though problematic, provides so many venues to get your work out there. It was very, very difficult to get seen. For us, it was like getting published in 3 architectural magazines that just published the mainstream. So that's great. I think there's a lot more activist organizations that are around that you could work on. But also I would say this, and this maybe sounds a little patting myself on the back, but I think by trying to do design research like you seem to be doing, by situating yourself maybe in a safer space like a university that should foster that, allows you to do this kind of work that you can't do if you're in practice with clients, right? Because they care about money and budget and this and that and schedule, right? So I would say that or maybe it's another way of looking why, about studs still being meaningful. It was that work I did when I was maybe in your place, right? When I didn't have a lot of clients, I didn't have a lot of money, but that was the work that still I carry with me today, and I'm just lucky enough to have I don't know if I'm lucky enough, but to have broken into this other realm, which I never imagined, and I think that I try to remember why I'm there, I think.
Yeah.
And so I think you guys are in a good place. Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, we're also privileged in so many ways, and so I think it was also, we realized at some point that it was our responsibility it was our duty to act upon the privilege that we hold, and strive for the public good. And I think we talked to Alma about it at some point, saying that everybody is under the same, not the same, under the pressure of neoliberalism, under the pressure of a lot of oppressive systems, but maybe like the best way to do this is that in order to find these safer spaces for yourself, then you just need to learn how to be the least dependent on the system. If we're told to earn money, then and earn more and more and more money, then maybe like you need to find a way to live with less money in order to fight for what you believe in.
Yeah.
I think there's also an interesting aspect in that. There's a conversation maybe between two generations, but also two different contexts. So here is a more like Nordic European context, and you're US-based, and then you're within a field of theory which is also developing at a different pace. And I think that was quite interesting when you said that you were contacted with a lot of European researchers interested in the topic now, because I don't think we have the same body of research when looking at this question in Europe to some extent, which is why then looking back at the US and now talking about institutional support maybe for those questions and like the place that it could have in an architecture school and everything, I think it's not yet there in
But
in
you're
Europe
saying
as
it's
well.
not in Europe, or it's more
not as much in Europe. There's a lot of like, it's much more instigated by students, to different ways, but there's still very much little voice for that, which is also very interesting in that, in that difference. But you were also in that
But do you
position
think,
to some extent
is your
before.
impression that there's more in the States than there is in Europe?
Yeah, because I think those topics
Yeah,
are much
and
more
the-
sensitive in the States to some extent, and also there's a bigger responsibility on this very prestigious big universities that need to like queer wash their curriculum, greenwash their buildings, and then need to have a lot of things to do, and they have to take into account all the different re-emergence of different questions that we don't see in the same perspective here to some extent. But that is also problematic.
But that's a really, I mean, I think about this a lot, and my friend Sophie is in the audience, who we've become friends for the last kind of 5 years. We met in Stockholm. And when we met, I was working on this project at the National Museum, and it was even before we met, and I was sitting with my museum colleagues, and Trump was going to run, and the people, my colleagues around me said, "Oh, Joel, you must be really worried about this." And I was like, "No, this is nothing's going to happen." We really believe that, and who would have thought, right? And I've often felt, you know, going back to the States, and I continue to do after being in your well-run, what seem like well-run social democratic states where people get health care and universities paid for, like that this is a kind of, you know, not a paradise, but infinitely better. And I've often felt that maybe these kinds of issues that we're dealing with in America are maybe not as pronounced here. And again, I'm not sure of that. That's what my impression, because you live in a much better, well-organized country that you know believes that the government has give health care or give women time off, you know, and men off, right? I'm not being very clear. So I guess what I'm saying that like when I go home, sometimes I'm proud that at least in America, we, for better for worse, like maybe raise a lot of these issues. I don't know, earlier than other places, but it's only because we're such a terrible, 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 terrible place right now. I mean, you have no idea. Okay, and it gets worse. And also, I mean, I think the issue though is, and I'm hearing it again, that you know, like in Sweden, I mean, Sophie, you could talk about that. I mean, or not. But anyway, I mean, we hear this is sort of happening now in Europe, and so we're not alone. But maybe that'll happen here.
But I think because they're much less pronounced in Europe to some extent, because of like maybe more seeming equality or access to different possibilities, doesn't mean that they don't exist,
Yes,
which I think sometimes is an argument that because they're much less pronounced, we have tendency to fail to address them as well to some extent, which I think then is a bit the difference.
And the risk of being gaslit is, I think, much higher.
Here,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's true.
I think we have a last question, but since we're running out of time, I don't know if anybody in the audience has some, you know, has really the urge to be in dialogue with Joel.
No,
And ask,
to you guys. Yeah.
and ask a question, or well, okay, well then I'll go ahead with mine. No, but yeah, I mean, like during the preparation of this Q&A session, like we talked a lot, and I think like we saw a common interest in between you and us, and between our practices to formulate these alternative futures in somehow in a material physical, spatial ways. And when we described our practice exutoire as a queer practice of architecture, I think we wanted to emphasize on this potential for queer theory to be a lens through which we can design a more equitable future. So we can see that this really resonates with you. So our question is, why do you care so much about design? And what role and what importance, do you assign with design here?
Why do I care so much about design?
Yeah. In this context.
Although I could give a very long-winded explanation, but because look, I guess I err on if there's a false binary between nature or nurture, like why we made, it's always the intersection of sort of biology, physiology, psychology, your family, your upbringing, and that's so shaped by cultural and social forces. But I grew up, in the 50s, when I was very young, knowing that I was wrong. I didn't know that I was gay, but I had a profound sense that I didn't fit in. I mean, you used the word misfit. I was wrong in a way that made me unacceptable and absolutely unlovable. And so the thing that I also gravitated towards, and this is not uncommon for gay men, were things that were considered to be feminine, right? So I liked even art, to draw, and I liked theater and going to ballet. And I probably, if I had grown up in a different time, I wouldn't have been an architect. I probably would have been a fashion designer or probably a set designer or something like that. But I felt like I couldn't. It was wrong. But I guess what I wanted to say is, and this risks what I completely am against, is essentializing gayness as if gay people are innately interested in fashion or design or have some aesthetic sensibility. Maybe because it's forbidden, we become, I don't know, who knows. But I love really just beautiful things. And some people who know me, I come to Scandinavia, I've been collecting glass. And for me, my pleasure is just to look at a beautifully designed thing. Right? But I also know that for myself, that in my teaching and practice, that I have to resist that, loving beautiful things for their own sake, okay? But also sort of being interested in the way in which design or the design environment, again, getting back to this theme, shapes, even in unconscious ways, and makes possible certain forms of social interaction and not. So I guess what I'm saying is that I believe in design for that reason, but I think I came to it because of my love, but my need to resist what I love, purely making beautiful things. So I don't know if that's a kind of good or kind of answer to that question. Yeah,
definitely. And I think even though I feel like we're very reluctant to essentialize queerness, for example, or queer theory in design, but we really want to leave a certain space for trials and errors in order, because we need physical cultural artifacts of what potentially a queer architecture is, in order for it to have the ground to be built up on and to be developed by future generations. And thank you for contributing to that and for leading that.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyway.